Good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center on this lovely dog days of summer, August in DC. Hopefully you all are nice AC wherever you are. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center, where I've been hanging out for 23 years, putting on meetings, exchanges, and in the last couple of years, just webinars, no live meetings yet in person. We focus a lot on US-China energy cooperation. Plastic waste issues has been a big topic. And of course, China's Belt and Road, overseas investment and infrastructure has been a growing theme in my project. And on that note, today's topic is we're talking about China fast-tracking its high-speed trains at home and on the road. I want to note too that the Wilson Center's Asia program has co-sponsored this event, and I want to thank them for that. So the Chinese government, they've been fast-tracking high-speed train network construction, which today covers over 24,000 miles of track. And not a surprise, by 2025, the government plans to double this amount of track. We can't even imagine that in the US, because that's even longer than the transcontinental highway railroad in the United States. And Chinese companies, though, they've also been taking the kind of the technology and the know-how that they've developed at home to build construction projects overseas, particularly in Southeast Asia. There's massive investments going on in Indonesia's Jakarta-Bandung line, the Trans-Lao railroad, which is a road that's going to go down to Singapore eventually, where one of our speakers actually lives. And there's also going to be lines branching out from there. Now, in this panel, we're going to talk about some of the successes and challenges of China's high-speed railroads in kind of balancing growth with environmental and labor concerns at home and abroad. And I'm just going to get right to it, right? It's a high-speed train meeting. We want to go fast, fast, fast for all of you out there to get to the conversation. So we're going to start out with Dr. Xiao Ma, who's an assistant professor of political science at Peking University. He's going to talk about the intense intergovernmental bargaining that accelerated, pun intended, high-speed train network and economic growth in some cities, but it also did face some challenges. His talk today is drawing on his dissertation, which I love it. He turned it into a book just recently out called Localized Bargaining: The Political Economy of China's High-Speed Railroad Program. So high-speed publication of that too, Xiao Ma. Now, the next station will be Dr. Selina Ho, who's an assistant professor at the National Singapore University. She teaches in international affairs and co-directs the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. She's going to talk about the broader geopolitical implications of China's railway cooperation in Southeast Asia. And her comments are going to tap into her book that came out, kind of poor timing, Selina. It came out right at the beginning of COVID, so you couldn't do a book talk, but you probably did Zoom talks back then. But I'm glad we could bring you back and pull you in with some other folks. So her book is called The River of Iron: Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia. It was co-authored with David Lampton and Cheng-Chwee Kuik. And yeah, got to tromp out in the fields with them for many months, a year or so. We'll hear stories about that later. Our caboose today is Dr. Kelly Wanjing Chen, who's a research assistant in the Division of Social Science at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She's going to wrap up our discussion by sharing some of the hidden labor struggles and other inequities that emerged from the massive Trans-Lao railway project. Now, all three of these people have boots on the ground field work, slightly different ground. I mean, Selina's tromped around with her colleagues in Southeast Asia, where literally her boots got muddy. Kelly was in Laos, and Xiao Ma was talking about, he said he didn't go out, he didn't get his boots muddy, but he visited many of the cities and kind of like he said, the boring backroom discussions, but it's a fascinating stuff. Your book is great, Xiao Ma. So let's get you started. So pull up your PowerPoint, Xiao Ma, and I want to tell the audience that if you look underneath the live stream, there's a little widget that says event chat. You can start submitting questions anytime now. Love it if you can put your name and affiliation so we know who's asking. And yeah, so start asking questions now. You can submit one every 10 minutes. So hey, if you start now, you can get a bunch of questions in before the talks are done. Every speaker is going to speak for about 8 minutes. And the virtual mic is over to you. Thank you so much, Xiao Ma.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
You sound great, and your
Okay.
PowerPoint looks great.
Okay. Thanks for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's great to have this discussion with Selina and Kelly. Both, I admire both work a lot. I want to start my presentation with a story. So a protest took place in the street of two small cities in Sichuan province in May 2015. The names of the cities are Lingshui and Dazhu. The trigger for the protest was the announcement made by the provincial government a few days ago. The province decided to build a new high-speed rail into the regions where these two cities are located. But these two cities didn't get a station. So the protesters were protesting against this decision and hoping new stations can be built in their own cities. Over 20,000 people went onto the street. Because of the scale was so large, it even made it to the headlines of New York Times. The protest was unusual in several ways, but the most prominent feature is the significant tolerance local government demonstrated in the process of the preparation and also when in the preparation of the protest and also when the protest occurred. We can see in Dazhu, even police also showed up on the scene and peacefully coexist with the protesters. We also see the protesters, they made a lot of preparations. They wear, some of them wear the same color t-shirt. They also have their banner printed. So on the left, the banner says, "Railway, please do not abandon millions of people in Lingshui." So a city with size of million is really a small city in China. And the banner on the right says, "To get rich, Dazhu people need railways." So for anyone who familiar with Chinese politics, Chinese local government treats social stability as a top priority and often spare no effort in nip any forms of social mobilization in the bud. But in this occasion, they demonstrate a significant amount of tolerance. In fact, the incident was not isolated one. Numerous similar incidents took place in China in the past decades. For example, the left photo shows a similar mass mobilization in which local residents were gathering signatures on banners demanding a station, a high-speed railway station to be built in the city in 2014 in Xingye, Henan province. On the right photo shows a similar banner was made and displayed in the street of Jingzhou, Hubei province in 2015. These incidents took place against the backdrop of China's rapid expansion of its high-speed railway network. So China began the construction of the high-speed railway in 2004. In the next 18 years, the mileage of the network grew from 0 to 40,000 kilometers, or as Jennifer just mentioned, 24,000 miles. That's twice the length of any other country's high-speed railway combined. The Chinese government invested an astronomical amount of money in this project. The right figure shows the annual government investment in railways. So the number has stabilized at around 800 billion RMB or 120 billion US dollar per year since 2014. To put that number in context, the interstate highway system in the United States, according to a report released by the Department of Transportation in 1991, cost in total 260 billion US dollar over the span of 4 decades. But Chinese government invest 120 billion US dollar a year since 2014. So by any measure, the high-speed railway network in China is the largest infrastructure program in human history, perhaps. But we see significant regional and temporal variations in the build-out of this railway network. The left figure presents you the number of high-speed railway stations per million people by province. We see a significant amount of variations across different places. And the right figure shows the number of high-speed railway stations by city. Places that are very close by with similar needs for railway services often gets their first high-speed railway built years apart, if not decades. So how do we explain such variations? With billions of dollars of government investment involved, politics must play a role. So in my book, I investigate an so far overlooked aspect of Chinese politics, which I think plays an important role in shaping railway benefit. I call it localized bargaining. So localized bargaining refers to bottom-up policy solicitation by territorial governments. Here I'm talking about provinces, cities, and counties. I use the term localized for two reasons. In these bargainings, the subject of bargainings are programs regulated by central government. Local government are trying to pull these programs to their own jurisdictions. And also places that are close by, they are not cooperating or coordinating on these bargainings. In fact, close by localities are often rivalries in the competition to gain access to these projects. So they also differ in their bargaining strategies. This is why I call it localized bargaining. Localized bargaining exists in China for two reasons. First, many important policy resources are now still controlled and regulated by the central government. When local governments want to build important infrastructure projects like subways, seaport, airport, or railways, they can't just do it by themselves. They must first receive approval from the central government before they can go ahead with the construction. But within the central government, there's not a unified agency responsible for the management of these projects. Instead, there is a fragmented authority in the central decision-making process. So here I want to use the process of high-speed railway decision-making to illustrate this fragmented authority. To build a railway, localities first need to have its proposed railway to be included in the medium to long-term railway network plan. So it needs to submit the proposal to the National Development and Reform Commission, a very powerful economic bureaucracy in the central government, the China Railway Corporation, formerly the Ministry of Railway, and also the Ministry of Transport. The three ministries will evaluate the report independently and make their decisions. So any objections can kill the proposal. After the railway is included in the railway network plan, localities need to submit the preliminary project feasibility report, which will be evaluated by the China Railway Corporation. And then the project suggestion report, which will be evaluated by the National Development and Reform Commissions. And then the project feasibility report, which will be evaluated by as many as 5 different ministries with very different specialties and interests in the central government. So this is the most important report. After that, local government can submit the preliminary project design report to the China Railway Corporation for vetting. So only complete all these steps, only after completing all these steps can local government formally begin the construction of railways. So there are many ministries with very different interests, specialties, and sometimes even conflicting interests in this process. This necessitates bargainings and coordinations on the part of local government in order to gain access. So here I want to use a small example to illustrate how these fragmented authorities can cost local government project in high-speed railways. So the map shows the Beijing-Harbin high-speed railways. The high-speed railway was actually built in 2 phases. The northern phase, which connects Shenyang and Harbin, began construction in 2009, and everything was very smooth. But the segment that connects Beijing and Shenyang was delayed. The construction was delayed for 5 years because residents along the line have concerns over its environmental impact once the operation began. They were worried that the train will make very big noises. So they submit complaint letters to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And the ministries vetoed on the local proposal 3 times before it finally approved the project. So that's why this segment's construction was delayed for 5 years. So China has 31 provinces, 330 municipalities, and 2,800 counties. They are all submitting proposals and their ideas for project to the central ministries. So how can one place's project gets prioritized? There are very different strategies. There are different strategies of bargainings. So local leaders, they will pay personal visits to Beijing to meet with bureaucrats in these central ministries. Local government even established permanent offices in Beijing to accommodate such needs. So they are like domestic embassies for Chinese localities. Local government also tolerate spontaneous expressions for high-speed railway stations by citizens. So this goes back to the story I tell at the very beginning. By having people in the streets, localities are sending a clear and a strong message to the decision makers at higher levels. If you don't make policy concession to me, you are risking bringing further, greater threats to social stability. So this puts a lot of pressures on decision makers. Also, places are also mobilizing different kind of social connections to get access to the resources. So here I want to use a very small example of the railway that connects Lanzhou and Chongqing, two major cities in West China. So the places along the route of these railway, they first submit their proposal for this new in 1994. Other proposal. This proposal was sent without a reply. The places sent a letter eventually reached the desk of then Premier Zhu Rongji, who directed the Ministry of Railways to expedite the research on this project. So this is how this railway project gets started to go through the formal regulatory process. So I just give you a sneak peek of all the politics and policy process behind this build out of perhaps the largest infrastructure program in human history. So for more details, you're welcome to read my book, Localized Bargaining. Thanks. I think that's all for my presentation.
Thanks so much, Xiao Ma. He sped through it. No, but it's a great taste. And I'm wondering about if you've ever talked to David Lampton, the book, Fragmented Authoritarianism obviously was something you cited, but no, I love it. And I know that we're going to have some questions about a little bit more. I'd like to go a little bit more in the Q&A later, just so you know about some of the environmental issues. And there's definitely benefits of trains in terms of environment. And just we're going to move over to Selina. Just a moment previously, a guy named Michael Dedu asked the question, does China intend to help other countries to have these good trains? And I have to say yes. And so we've answered the first question very quickly, but with the details coming from Selina. Let's go on the road with Selina to talk about Southeast Asia. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a few minutes.
Sure, that's good. And just reminding people in the audience that please start submitting your questions now, because we're going to have a fast and furious discussion, and I want to make sure you get your voice in. Great. Here you go. The floor is all yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jennifer. It's my pleasure to be here with you and with Xiao Ma and with Kelly, and I look forward to the discussion later on. So our book actually came out in 2020, right in smack in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But we managed to have a number of book talks, and 2 years later, we still get to talk about it. So I'm pretty happy about that. Thanks, Jennifer. I wrote this book with two other co-authors, David Lampton, Fragmented Authoritarianism, that's part of his work, and Cheng-Chwee Kuik, our colleague in Malaysia. The book is really based on more than 200 interviews in 9 countries, in Southeast Asia and China, and obviously in the United States as well. And as you read the book, you'll know that we allow the interviewees actually to speak for themselves. There are many nice quotes in there. But let me briefly give you the sketch of the book. There are really 3 parts to it. There's a Chinese perspective, there's a Southeast Asian perspective, and then there's the whole geoeconomic and geopolitical competition surrounding the high-speed rail, and more broadly the BRI as a whole. Now, so the story actually starts off by telling the story. The book starts off by telling the story from China's side, how China built up this domestic high-speed railway industry, which is the topic of Xiao Ma's book. How does this high-speed railway come about? Not so much in localized bargaining, but looking at how the different ministries, how China develops the resources, technology, human resources, finance to build their own domestic industry. And then only when China was able to build up its own high-speed railway industry, then it began to export its technology, its finance, its resources, human resources, externally into Southeast Asia, not just Southeast Asia, but to different parts of the world. But our story is focused on Southeast Asia. And this is really the focus of the story, the vision of the Pan-Asia Railway. Now, just to make it very clear, this is actually not a Chinese vision to start with. This was a Southeast Asia vision. It started with the colonists, actually, the French and the British colonists in the 19th century and in the early 20th centuries. And later on, the Japanese as well. They think about railways, right? As a way for war and also for transporting goods and people and a source of logistical supplies and all that. And later on, after the Japanese, the ASEAN also think about it, Association of Southeast Asian Studies thought about it, ADB, and then Malaysia itself, the former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad was really a key proponent of this project. But Southeast Asia did not have the money for it. So I think this project, was brought to the attention of the Chinese as early as the 1990s. But it's only after 2000, when China became richer, when China had the resources, when China had the technology and the manpower to actually bring this idea, this vision of the Pan-Asia Railway into fruition. So it was essentially a Southeast Asia vision, but it was brought to fruition at a time when China was ready and able to provide the kind of resources that Southeast Asian countries do not have. So one part of the book, the first 3 chapters actually talk about the debates, the debates within China about this Pan-Asia Railway, as well as the BRI more broadly. So it was something that, the Chinese leaders, experts in society were talking about, the risks involved in the project, the strategies that were involved, and then the debates between the continentalists and those who favor the maritime. And that's how we get the Belt and Road Initiative. We have both the continentalists and the maritime. It was a very nice compromise among them. Then from chapters 4 to 6, we tell the story from the Southeast Asian perspective. Why are there diverse responses to China among Southeast Asian states? If you look at the map, it involves all these countries, right? It will start off from southern China, from Kunming, all the way to Vientiane, Laos, and then to Bangkok, Thailand, then down to Malaysia, and all the way to Singapore. So this is what the vision was all about. So why is it that different countries reacted to it differently? It's not built in Vietnam, it's not built in Myanmar. So what are the reasons for all these things? So one of the key, that we look at 2 key variables, actually, the legitimating narrative, right? Whether it was economic development or nationalism that actually legitimizes the governments of these recipient countries, and the level of political pluralization. That explains why there were these diverse responses. I won't go into it, but something else. I would want to focus actually on the agency that smaller states have when they respond to China. Their bargaining with China, and the implementation of the project. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on for the next couple of minutes. So just to show a picture of the fieldwork where we are walking around in some red mud. This is after a rain. I'm wearing a raincoat, as you can tell. It was a slight drizzle going on, and then we're just tramping through some of these construction sites. So this is actually in Laos. The Laos sections has been built already since December last year. And Kelly will talk about it a bit more, I believe. But it was very interesting, the stories that we get to hear from the local communities. But let me go on with my presentation. So what affects the bargaining power of smaller states as they negotiate with China? There's a long negotiation process that goes on. So one of the first things that we discovered was size, wealth, and location matter. So middle powers like Indonesia and Thailand actually have greater leverage than, say, Laos. So they are able to bargain better terms for themselves. So Indonesia, for instance, was able to get the Chinese to agree to no sovereign guarantees for the project and a lower interest rate. Geography also gives Thailand a major advantage. All the routes, whether it's in Central Road, the West Road, or the Western or the Eastern Road, they all have to go through Thailand in order to reach Singapore. So you can imagine that Thailand actually have quite a bit of advantage when it comes to bargaining. In the end, they decided that they will finance the projects themselves. So, one of the interesting things that a key government advisor that we spoke to in Thailand described it, this bargaining power that Thailand has. And I quote this, right? He described Thailand as, in quotes, a beautiful woman who can wait to choose the best suitor. I mean, there are all these really funny quotes inside the book, which I hope you all get to read. But anyway, so he's referring to the great powers that come wooing at Thailand's doorsteps. So this gives Thailand a lot of leverage in bargaining. And then in terms of state capacity, secondary states, smaller states actually have more options when they have greater capacity. When capacity refers to government institutions, robust government institutions, civil society, rule of law, whether they have oversight, monitoring, regulative abilities, human resources. So Singapore would be a country that has state capacity, and Singapore is also not overly dependent on China economically. There is a section in the book that talks about how about the now aborted attempt to build this high-speed rail between Malaysia and Singapore. There was talk about the Chinese companies wanting to build that, and there was competition from the Japanese. You can read the story for yourself inside the book. But then you can see that countries like Laos will be heavily reliant on the Chinese economy. It doesn't have technical expertise. So even the feasibility study for the China-Lao high-speed rail was actually conducted by China. Now, the third factor, the third condition that affects bargaining power will be domestic politics and public opinion. So, leaders like former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib, and President of Indonesia, Jokowi, they have been attacked for selling their countries to China by public opinion. There are concerns over whether locals will actually benefit, because the Chinese often bring their own materials, their own workers, sidelining some of these local SMEs in recipient countries. So there's all this negative public opinion, and there's also some form of unhappiness over Chinese presence within these countries. And this kind of pressures actually exert significant pressures on the leaders themselves. So, that actually helps the bargaining for the leaders of these countries. They can go to Beijing and say, or Chinese company and say, look, I have all these at stake in my domestic position. Therefore, you please give me better concessions so I can get approval from people within my own country to support the project. Now, let me just turn very quickly also to some of the challenges of implementation. So it's not just at the bargaining stage that the Chinese face all these challenges. So you can imagine that when Chinese companies, Xiao Ma will tell you how Chinese companies build high-speed railways so quickly within the country themselves. I'm sure they face challenges as well. But in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese companies are completely unfamiliar with political systems, societal differences, these challenges are going to be added on. There are these additional veto actors that come into play when you deal with democratic countries like Indonesia. So like in the case of Indonesia, decentralization is a big thing. So the Jakarta-Bandung Railway, which is not part of this Pan-Asia Railway, but a significant part of it, and we addressed of these railway stuff that China is building in Southeast Asia, and we address it in the book. It is really the Jakarta-Bandung Railway is a negotiation between Beijing and Jakarta, but it doesn't involve local regencies. The regencies are really powerful because of decentralization after 1998. They stall in terms of land acquisition. They encounter a lot of resistance, and in total, you have 29 districts and 95 villages in West Java, which are directly impacted by the high-speed rail construction. So you can imagine the amount of difficulties Chinese construction companies as they have to deal with these powerful local authorities. Now, another factor is bureaucratic resistance, and I can bring up the example of the State Railway Authority of Thailand. Now, the State Railway Authority of Thailand actually makes money by selling land, but loses money on rail operations. So they have to be compensated for the loss of land. This became an issue as the Chinese companies built the stretch within Thailand itself. Now, for any infrastructure project to succeed, there also needs to be some champions, political national champions within recipient countries. In Malaysia, when former Prime Minister Najib was, he lost power. He got in trouble for the 1MDB scandal. He lost power, And but he was actually a champion of the East Coast Railing and the KL Kuala Lumpur Singapore high-speed railway. So when he lost power, the projects actually lost a very powerful patron. And then the other obstacles were more technical, and you can see that in Laos, where there are lots of mountains and hills, very hilly terrain, very challenging to build all these railways and tunnels and bridges that the trains will need. So this is what's happening. This is the sketch of my book. Some of the stories are in there. I hope you get to read it. And now I'll hand it back to Jennifer, and then Kelly probably round it up with our presentations. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, so it's Kelly, you are our caboose today. Could you good sharing your slides, and yeah, keep asking questions, folks, on the widget, and the floor or the station is all yours, Kelly.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. So first of all, I'd like to thank the China Environment Forum of Wilson Center to invite me on this webinar. So Selina and Xiao have shared with us how the vision of the railway, China's railway, come together through negotiations among an amazing spectrum of actors. So I'll pick up from there to offer some insight on how visions on paper are brought into life in reality. So China's infrastructure development, railway and beyond, impress and concern the world not only by their massive scales, but also by their mesmerizing speed of realization. Signature projects in particular are pushed to build fast as a state strategy to project power and acquire legitimacy for policy agendas in public eyes. So a quick example of that would be the gigantic field hospital erected to combat Wuhan's initial outbreak in 2020. So basically, by building a hospital within a mere 6 days and live broadcasting that process on national TV, the Chinese government, then facing domestic backlash for its initial slow response to the pandemic, effectively swayed public opinion. So in a campaign for Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing also strategically pressed for speedy construction to win fanfare and to stamp out controversies. But if you think about it, the very nature of mega infrastructure itself, set in a condition of global south, denied the possibility of speedy construction, fragmented state powers, as Selina already talked on, and a dearth of resource and expertise in general, made building infrastructure in certain contexts an arduous task that often fail. So even against such odds, China still managed to achieve the speedy construction of a few Belt and Road projects so far. And one of them is the Trans-Laos Railway. So this project hits ground in 2015 and was completed last year, suffering only a slight delay from its initial deadline of 2020. And in the rest of the presentation, I will give you some insights on how this railway is able to be built so fast. And to do so, I'll take you back to the point when the railway was pinned down solidly on paper. And the slide here shows you a diagram of the railway's financial setup that was agreed upon in bilateral negotiations in 2015. It was a milestone that paved the way for construction. So as you can see here, the railway was set to be developed as a joint venture. And in terms of finance, the project was set to be on a 40-60 equity debt ratio, which means shareholder would supply 40% of funding, and the creditor, in this case, China Exim Bank, would provide the rest. So Lao, as a minor shareholder on the project, would need to contribute some 700 million cash, but it was financially incapable to do so. This problem was resolved by a separate loan made by Exim Bank to cover 2/3 of Laos equity. So by that calculation, eventually the Lao state would be responsible of chipping in only $250 million cash as its equity to jumpstart the construction. So this agreement, upon reaching on paper, become basically a reference point that enable a tendering bidding process to start. And then here goes the brief organization structure of the construction team eventually recruited to build the railway in 2016. And you can see that the railway is administered by a joint venture project company at the top. And the project company then divided the railway into 6 sections and assigned each section to a Chinese SOE to manage. So these mid-level coordinators are in full charge of the section they are assigned to. They allocate contract to smaller firms, supervise their progress, and make payment accordingly. And below this managerial stratum are firms undertaking the de facto work. And most of these are small and medium enterprise operated by private investors from China. So at this level, you're going to encounter key actors that people refer to as Laoban in Chinese, which means people who own and operate their business, as opposed to managers of SOEs who just operate but don't own a business. So this subcontracting cascade clarify how construction would be carried out and supervised, as well as how funding would be allocated. And it was put to work in 2016. So what complicated the matter from here onward is that financial progress behind the scene did not move along with the construction progress. So most of the funding planned for the railway failed to arrive on time. And this void was rooted in the pact relation between equity and credits in banking wise. Like all kind of lending practice, the Exim Bank would not release a loan until the required equity was submitted. So in practice, the Lao government was unable to provide the cash equity it agreed on, and resulting in basically a significant delay in credit provision. And this struggle lasted well into the railway's constructions and up until 2019. So now I want to focus on how these upper level financial struggle were experienced by downstream actors on the railway. So first stand these Laobans who were contracted to receive monthly reimbursement for their work on the railway. As you can imagine, these investors mostly sign up on the project because of its strong state backing, hence financial security, but only to experience disillusion when promised payment cycles were missed again and again. And the situation started to build up the tension between the Laoban and the SOEs on the projects. And it eventually prompts an intervention from Chinese Central State directly in 2017, in which Beijing basically made an emergency mandate that the railway SOEs should use their own financial resource to pay for the construction first. But in practice, much of this financial burden was then further offloaded to contractors and suppliers due to their unequal power relation with the SOEs. Many of these Laoban found themselves without option but to pay for construction temporarily out of their own pocket in hope to recruit all the initial investment at once when the upper level financial struggle was sorted out. And when the contractors scrambled to build on without funding, labor exploitation in the form of delayed and denied wage payments was significantly exacerbated. At the beginning of the construction, most contractors on the railway, in fact, do resort to recruit local labor and have them work alongside Chinese technicians because local labor are obviously cheaper. But the problem is that local labor are usually brought in on a monthly payment regime because they count on the salary to pay for everyday necessities. And they reacted strongly when paycheck was delayed. So in some camps, local workers brought their families and friends to besiege their Laoban's office and wouldn't leave dispersed until they get paid. And more violent forms of protest, sometimes involving workers threatening their boss with guns and bullets, also occurred. So local labor mostly quit the railway with their wage paid, but they didn't come back anymore because of this mistrust that already built up between them and the Chinese employers. So this dynamic led to contractors to shift to rely on imported workers from China. While Chinese laborers were more expensive, they were not on a monthly wage regime though. Instead, they were arranged to receive lump sum of payment every 6 months or a year, which is a norm in China's domestic construction sector. So although this quantitative amount of wage promised in such arrangement would be larger than in a monthly system, it allowed Laoban to maintain construction momentum in time of financial difficulty. But as the railway's credit problem dragged on and well into later half of the railway's construction, it was common for Chinese workers to receive nothing at the end. But as migrant workers stuck in an estranged country, they lacked the bargaining power you see from the Lao peers. So many simply quit without even getting anything. But in some occasions, the aggrieved Chinese workers also strategize ways for collective resistance. So my slide here shows you a photo taken before the Chinese New Year in 2018, and some workers skipped their immediate employer and protest for wage directly from the SOE managing their section of the railway, because this SOE's labor camp is located at a more conspicuous geographical locations. And in order to solicit public support for their protests, they held banners written in multiple languages. But these workers were quickly dragged away and repatriated back to China, and a new batch of workers were recruited, unaware of the railway's financial situation at all. So basically, the railway gets a bill by cycling through multiple batches of contractors and workers. So going back to the question of why China builds so fast, especially even when moves abroad. So in the case of Trans-Laos Railway, we can see that the facade of speed is sustained by squeezing out capital from small investors, as well as putting vulnerable Chinese labor to task. And oftentimes, Chinese dominance in the construction of Beijing-sponsored infrastructure project is interpreted as them being capable of reaping off the benefit from development at the cost of local interests. But in this case, you can see that it can also be a symptom showing that local labor and enterprise possess more agency to resist exploitation than their Chinese counterparts. So, so if you want more information, you can check out this article of mine that came out in 2020. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That was really fascinating. So we went from some of the big broad brush descriptions and then this fascinating case from Laos, and there's got to be some other questions. I have more questions, but I want to kind of turn the table. I've got a few questions that came in from the audience. I want to also suggest that Dr. Marshall B. Lloyd, your question, it seemed like I think you hit send halfway. Can you submit the other half of your question in a second? But yeah, I actually would like to ask Xiao Ma. I know that he has a question for my other panelists. Okay. And then I have plenty, but I like giving, I'm giving some power to my speakers today.
Thank you, Jennifer. So thanks, Selina and Kelly, for this fascinating details on what's going on the ground in Southeast countries on China's infrastructure project. So when I listen to your presentations, I hear how the host countries, for example, Thailand or Indonesia as a whole bargain with China. And of course, there are divisions within the host countries. So I'm curious if the same process that we observe within China between local government of China and the central government, they have to navigate this fragmented decision-making system in order to gain access to infrastructure investment, also applies to these host countries. So I hear my colleagues who are doing China's overseas infrastructure programs, for example, the electricity project in Indonesia, they were talking about that the recipients has to deal with, for example, the Ministry of Commerce, the Exim Bank that Kelly just mentioned, also the state-owned insurance companies, and also other economic bureaucracy that vets these projects. I was wondering if any of these dynamics plays out as a factor in the Southeast Asian countries. I look forward to, I'm just curious about these issues.
Thanks, Xiao Ma. Selina, you want to start off?
Yeah, so well, I mean, the focus of my book is really not on our book is not on how the recipient countries actually try and figure out how they're going to. It wasn't the focus on the fragmented authoritarianism within China per se, but rather how the fragmented authoritarianism, a fragmented authority within Southeast Asian countries is actually affecting the progress of the Chinese projects. So, but I can imagine that in many cases that the negotiations will have to be on multiple levels. So there'll be negotiations with Beijing. A lot of the Pan-Asia Railway project is actually very much bilaterally negotiated between national governments. So, but at the implementation level, then you had to negotiate with the banks, whether it's the CDP or the China Exim Bank. You got to negotiate with the companies, and then you probably got to negotiate with whoever is doing the feasibility studies, the regulatory authorities in China, and all that. So I would imagine that that would be the case, but it wasn't quite the focus of our book. Maybe Kelly, when you're on the ground in Laos, whether you see some of these things happening, because when I'm looking actually at your presentation, I realized that you were talking about how many 6 SOEs in being involved, and I can imagine that local workers, local companies, or the local authorities will have to talk to 6 SOEs, and then how's that going to work out? I think that could be quite a huge challenge for them, right, Kelly?
Hi. So in terms of how recipient country navigates Chinese system to get fundings, everything, I mean, the question is really who is the representative of recipient country. So in my case, because I start following the project when the implementation starts, so the representative for this project to negotiate with different state factions was the project company itself. And was a joint venture which is staffed mostly by Chinese from the SOEs who hold share on the project, and then it was compensated by Laos staff who mostly have government experience. So it is these people who are the active party chasing around different state bureaus for resource, and it's not only they have to cope and negotiate with Exim Bank about the credit provision, but also they find themselves in a situation that they have to be the party soliciting Lao government to submit equity as soon as possible. So they were basically being this central active actor who have to knit together different kind of resource. Yeah, and the Chinese working on the project company would complain a lot about how they didn't expect themselves shouldering such an outsized responsibility, because all other government bureaus, especially the Laos side of the government bureaus, are very laid back about the progress.
Wow.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was actually fascinated with Kelly's details as well, because a lot of times, we talk about like BRI investments in such broad brushstrokes that the Chinese go in, they get it done, and the kind of the nuance that, well, they had Lao workers and then they weren't paying them, but that shows that kind of the internal payment structure that, I mean, that was quite the headache. But actually to take one little step back, so well, we had this Bob Hare, who's a retired engineer. I don't know if he's a railway engineer, but said, but looking more broadly, who would be the overall coordinator of the Pan-Asia effort? China? And I'm thinking that this is a tricky question, because just the Laos example, I mean, it was negotiated by the governments, and this really complex management structure that had lots of bumps in it in terms of particularly how it impacted the workers. Selina, so who's in charge of the Pan-Asia effort?
If you're talking about an authority in China who's in charge of the BRI, it will be the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, right? And so they're probably the highest body coordinating some of these efforts among all the different ministries and agencies. But I think the Pan-Asia Railway, the key point is that all the negotiations are bilateral. So there's no coordinating body within for the whole project, right? So you see the China and Laos portion being built already. The China and Thai portion is slowly being built, but there are a lot of problems along the way. It's very slow. And then nothing's happening on the Malaysian side or Singapore side because of the politics in Malaysia that put a stop to it, the changes in government, and Singapore is unwilling to go ahead until some of these things have been sorted out. So there is actually no coordinating body because the Chinese negotiate bilaterally, it's not multilaterally. So there is no coordinating body. I think that's the answer I have.
It's a headless dragon. But you'd mentioned before that this was initially, you know, that the countries and ASEAN wanted this, but so ASEAN's not playing any kind of, I mean.
No, ASEAN is not consulted at all in this project. ASEAN actually has a master plan for connectivity. China has indicated that it's interested in trying to coordinate with ASEAN on this project, this master plan connectivity project. Nothing much is happening. And the whole, like I said, the negotiations for the Pan-Asia Railway was done bilaterally. It wasn't done through ASEAN or through any other body. Yeah.
Okay, that's well, and Bob just bopped right back in and said he wants a little. He says he's actually really interested, like in Lao, who is the contracting agency, and who defaulted on paying the workers, or was it the Chinese consortium? I think it was the Kelly. Like in terms of who was in charge, it's the JV, the joint venture was in charge.
So I think this is a clarifying question, right? So basically, the railway project company has Chinese share in it. So the share was held by Chinese SOEs, and these SOEs branch company would run each section of the railway, and they are the party that's selecting contractors and suppliers, awarding them with deals and supervise and handle the payments.
So it's really, but it's still very complex. All right, so I'm going to switch. One of the first questions that came in. This is directed to you, Xiao Ma. So he said it's from Claude Leblanc from Le Pignon. I don't speak French, so just you could laugh at me. Question to Xiao Ma. China is now focusing on connection between the medium cities, and why? But why and how do you analyze this phenomena? Like, why are you looking at this railway negotiation stuff?
So I think the construction goes into several phases, right? For the first 10 years, China was focusing on connecting major cities. That's the 4 centrally administered cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, and Tianjin, as well as provincial capitals. So since 2014 or 15, China begins to connect these second and third tier cities. I think that's where really the competition began, because there's no doubt that high-speed railway is going through, for example, Nanjing or Guangzhou or these major cities. But when we are looking at the second and the third tier cities, well, things can go both ways, right? So that's where the competition are coming. But according to the Ministry of Railway, that's the former Ministry of Railway, now the China Railway Corporation, by 2035, that's 13 years from now, every city with a population of 500,000 will have at least one high-speed railway station. So by then, there's no competition because every city eventually is going to end up having a station. So why are they still competing for it? I think promotion incentive of local officials plays a big factors in this process, because most Chinese local leaders, they serve in their positions for 2 or 3 years. They want as much as economic growth or as much as this kind of white elephant project during their tenure when they're local leaders. So that's why they're still competing for it, despite the fact that according to the plan, they eventually all are going to have it.
Thanks, yeah, but if you're first, you know, you reap some of the benefit. I like that. There's personal benefit, but also for your city.
Right.
But let me ask a question. So the high-speed rail, I mean, I think it's seen as an important strategy for not only connectivity, but also for low carbon development and transport.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, you noted that there were noise complaints, but are there benefits or also maybe not, or environmental harms that come from the railroad?
Sure. So I think certainly, now high-speed railway project become a signature project in China's pursuit for carbon neutrality. This is a very environmental way of traveling. So I think it also depends on what we are comparing to. High-speed railways certainly are more environmental friendly comparing to, for example, if you are driving by yourselves. But according to a World Bank report published in 2019, in fact, high-speed railway emits twice as much carbon per passenger compared with regular electric powered trains. For example, these ordinary commuter trains powered by electricity, simply because it's travels so fast that it requires more electricity. But high-speed railway only cost one-third of carbon emission per passenger compared with airplane. So compared with airplane, still it's much more environmental friendly. So it depends on what we are comparing to. So for the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, when they're evaluating a new project, in addition to the potential noise, the pollutions, they're also evaluating the damage a project can bring to the landscape. For example, if it's a grassland, if it's a forest, or it's a water reservoir, once the project built, how can that change the ecosystem of the existing systems? This is also a big factor in their consideration for these projects.
But I know for many years, I've had meetings that have talked about the how should I say it? The weak environmental impact assessment system in China. Have you seen?
That's a very good question. I think that's a very good question. So I think 2012 is a watershed. I think as an expert of China's environment policy, you must know Xi Jinping made the environmental protection as one of his core, core agenda, right? He has this saying says, blue mountain, green water is like gold mountain, silver mountain. Now the Ministry of Ecology and Environment become very powerful regulatory agencies, even though they cannot determine on where to build railway, but now they have this veto power to build, but not just railway, but also other kind of project. For example, chemical factories or nuclear power plant, they have this veto power. Now, I think the real watershed is 2012. Before, I would agree with you. It's only, I would say, a facade, or it's like it's a pro forma thing that most people do. But after 2012, environmental evaluation become really a headache for local Chinese officials. I talked to when they are seeking approval for these projects. I think it's mostly because of the pressure from above, from the leader, from President Xi Jinping.
Jennifer, may I have a two-finger here?
Please, of course.
Okay, this is questions for Xiao Ma to follow up what Xiao Ma was saying about environmental protection. So I'm not sure whether this is a fair question for you because you're looking at Chinese domestic, but one of the things that the BRI itself is actually changing and morphing. The focus, even before the pandemic, has been on quality projects, and also there is this movement towards projects that are more ecologically sustainable. So they are more conscious of environmental impact. I'm just wondering whether this consciousness within China itself about the environmental impact of the trains, is that kind of thinking being exported outside to these BRI projects? Here I have in mind not just trains, but dams. Jennifer, your favorite thing, dams, right? So I mean, China is still building dams within China and outside China, but what is the thinking there? I'm just wondering whether you have an update on that. Thanks.
Oh, unmute yourself. There you go.
Thanks for the question. I think this is a very important issue, but I'm not pretending I'm an expert on China's overseas environmental thinking. What I can say is what leads to Chinese local officials strictly obey these environmental regulations is because now in the cadre evaluation, so Chinese local officials, they will be subject to evaluation every year. This will determine their promotion, also their end of year bonuses, etc. So now in that evaluation, environmental issues plays a very large part. I would say more than 30%, some places even it's a veto, right? If you're not doing good on this item, no matter how fast you grow your economy, you're not good for promotion. It's because there's such domestic institution there, that's why Chinese local officials are paying attention to all these environmental regulations. I doubt if in the host countries, I think the domestic laws in the host countries will be the biggest constraints on China's overseas investment. Because otherwise, where are the incentives? Why they want to pay the extra money or do the extra research to comply with certain standard? I think it has to do with the law, but this is just my guess. I think this is a question that we're studying in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, and well, but Selina, I mean, both you and Kelly did talk about, well, I think it's like Kelly that mentioned, I think you both said something about like, like the, the Chinese companies are coming in and they're really the big dog doing the project. And then maybe Kelly, you said like the Laos government agencies were kind of laid back. But I mean, but Selina, in your own work, I mean, did you talked about how there was also, mirroring in China, there's also this local bargaining to get the railroad happening, in some of these countries. And that, but did you come across a lot of discussions on environmental impact and land use issues, or was this simply because we've heard plenty of stories over the years of other earlier overseas investments, like in Myanmar with the they just, property taken, people moved, villages moved. I mean, this is Cambodia. This is very common. Did you hear that also with, more broadly in your research?
Yeah, so in Laos, there are local communities, paddy fields where the tunnels and the railway tracks are going to go through. People have to move. Compensation was a big issue. There are environmental NGOs, and especially in places like Thailand. I mean, not in Laos, because Laos is a very closed system, very difficult. Although they are there, but there's a limit to how much they can do. In Thailand, environmental NGOs, I think, are much more powerful. And then, they do look at some of these issues. They do make their protests. But maybe let me just talk about dams, because dams is my other thing, right? So in Thailand, there was this, not dam specific, but the Mekong River. The Chinese were going to blast some of the rapids, some of the rocks in the middle of the Mekong to allow the big cargo ships to go through. They need the depth and the width for the cargo ships to go through. So some of these local environmental groups actually managed to stop the blasting. And then in the recent field trip that I made to Thailand, I met the guy who actually stopped it. He is known as Kruti. He actually won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2022 for stopping the blasting of the rapids. And he had this whole Mekong school. So environmental NGOs do have impact. So it really depends. So, Xiao Ma was talking about local laws and all. It's not just local laws. Local laws definitely, because if weak environmental laws, Chinese companies can do whatever they want. But also the other part of it is how powerful NGOs are. If you have strong, powerful civil society, NGOs, you're going to find that these projects will be more sustainable, environmentally more sustainable. Yeah.
Thanks. And Kelly, that's excellent. Can I go to you, Kelly, to talk a little bit about, I mean, you discussed mainly, I love, again, the map of the financial structure and the management. It's like, wow, controlled chaos. But you talked mainly about labor. Can you say anything about any insights you gained about like environmental impacts on communities? I mean, clearly communities were impacted by having jobs, not having jobs.
So in fact, I completely agree with Xiao Ma that the extent to which Chinese corporate are held to account for their environmental footprint really lies in local states. So if local state can beef up, they would be able to discipline these enterprises and what they do. So there was this really funny thing I encountered in the field, which is about hydropower projects. I'm kind of everywhere when it comes to Chinese investment overseas. And then it said, this is a hydropower project built with design to alleviate its environmental and social impact. So basically the dam was built with a floodgates that was destined to periodically discharge water for downstream local community. But what happened is that, of course, the company who run the dam doesn't want to discharge water. They want to hold water to produce electricity. But whenever there's official coming to visit, they discharge some water. So, I mean, the point is that really a local government should put a stronger effort for the company to really obey the rule. And then the other issues that I think the greening BRI slogans is becoming very performative, taken up in a very performative way by SOEs abroad. So the railway SOEs that I see really take that principle to their soul by building these green labor camps. So what they did is that they dug up these pots on cementized floors of the labor camp and built trees that is hard to survive. So they were like, this is our way of presenting that our project is greening than before. So I mean, they also are not creative or don't have the budgets or the actual powers to implement this kind of state mandates. So it's only in the performative aspect is what they can really do. So,
I mean, are there some kinds of environmental impact assessments that are being done on any of these railroad projects that, you know, Selina, Kelly, that you've heard of? Or is it also just, is it kind of like how EIAs used to be in China, just very superficial and not substantive? And there's also social environmental impact assessments. Selina?
Yeah, so like I was saying, in Laos, the feasibility studies, which includes the environment stuff, is being done by the Chinese companies. They are really just, I mean, Kelly can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're just like, you know. I mean, there is a conflict of interest here, right? If the Chinese are the ones to build it, and then they are the ones who do the feasibility studies, so it's really just performative, as Kelly so rightly described it. Kelly, would you agree?
yeah, I think that's completely what's going on the ground. So basically, in the environmental and social impact assessment, as I was told, was not done to check on the project, but to facilitate the project. They just take it as a necessary document to move forward.
Just Selina, did you have any questions to ask the other two? Because I want to be fair that since Xiao Ma asked a question.
Well, I did ask Xiao Ma the question, so maybe a question for Kelly. You know, what I'm really interested in is the end of your story. So, I mean, just you know, out of curiosity, so what happened to those protesters? Did they get paid in the end? I mean, the Chinese workers, did they get paid in the end? Those who actually protest, what happened to them?
Well, they get like a fraction of the payment and immediately put on a bus or plane to send back to China, and then they disappear because then there's a censorship and you can't do much within China. And also because Chinese laborers are usually recruited by each contractors at different time. So they usually come from different villages. So it's hard to form a kind of a collective movement to bargain for wage. So what happens is just most of them swallow their bitterness and move on with life. Yeah.
Oh,
so I have a question.
Good. I was just going to say, you ask your question.
Yeah, so you were just saying that in your presentation that Thailand is a prettier woman than Laos, of course, because it has much more power in terms of bargaining. So my question is that, but Laos is becoming this battleground for geopolitical influence now because China's rival countries like Vietnam, Japan, and United States now are like interested in putting in more money to shore up their influence. So do you see the Laos side playing these big powers with each other to try to, you know, enhance their bargaining power when it comes to China?
Yeah, I'm actually not saying that Thailand is a more beautiful woman than Laos. Laos is actually really quite beautiful. I love that country. But Thailand, you know, I actually think that, you know, Laos foreign policy has always been to balance all sides, diversify. So it's always been its conscious strategy to not just rely on China, but also inviting the Japanese, the Koreans, the Americans, the Europeans, other parts of Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries to come in when they can, because that's historically and, you know, in contemporary times, their strategy. The only thing that we see is that even though these are the efforts that Laos have put in, and definitely the US is very interested in what's happening in Laos now, but there are key problems. There are unresolved issues, which is the legacies of the Indochina wars over the unexploded mines there, and also the issue of human rights. So there is that consciousness that Laos are actually putting the United States at arm's length in that sense. It's very difficult for them to get close because there are all these human rights issues that are also going on. We're very worried of what the US will do. But obviously it's reaching out to as many countries as possible. But in my opinion, despite these efforts that Laos put in, it is inexorably being pulled into Chinese orbit, whether it liked it or not. At the end, the result is going to be like that, despite Laos' effort and other countries being interested in Laos. This is not to say that Laos doesn't have agency. Now, what's really interesting about Laos is that, it's such a small country surrounded by all these big neighbors, right? Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar, and then you have China, of course, on the border, right? What is really interesting is Laos actually play up its smallness. It embraces its smallness, it owns it, and it also owns and embraces its weakness. So they will say things like, we are lucky. This is from the interview. It's in the book itself. We are lucky. We have all these powerful neighbors. We can hitch, in a way, not hitch. The word wasn't hitch, but I'm just paraphrasing right now. That they can hitch on these countries to try and develop economically, and to strengthen themselves. So you see Laos accepting its status as a weaker and smaller country, but being intelligent about it and leveraging its weaknesses in a sense that because it's small and it's weak, it's not threatening. So it can try and balance all sides. But having said that, it's still, in my opinion, very difficult for Laos to escape the Chinese orbit.
Thanks for that. We just got a couple of minutes left. So does the Dr. Marshall B. Lloyd, an attorney, was asking just quickly if one of you could respond that if because the question of like the loans, like if Laos, for example, like they had to loan the money to actually become part of the equity partner. Are there some dangers of this, like when will China, if they can't pay back the loans for the high-speed train, is China going to take them over? There's just this kind of concern about kind of debt trap diplomacy here. Kelly, do you want to say anything about that, or?
Yeah, so first of all, regarding the term debt trap diplomacy, I think it implies a lot of intentionality from the Chinese side to intentionally bankrupt other country. So I think that's completely not true. But in this case, the loan on the railway, in terms of how it is structured, of course, it contains more risk because China is not only lending out for the project as a whole, but it's also covering part of funding for the Lao equity. So of course the project is financially riskier. So now the question becomes, what would happen if Lao fall default on these loans? So I mean, I think by historical patterns, China tend to approach this kind of matter either by delaying, pardoning, or increasingly they are up to just take shares on the project to compensate the loan that's not getting back. So it's not likely that China will impose something like structural adjustment program or all those policy package to a sovereign country. So, and the impact of that kind of default might be more projects, places limited, instead of you are having a society exposing to higher taxation and have welfare cutbacks. So yeah, we will have to wait and see what happens, but I think that's what is happening.
Yeah, and I want to, since you started us off, Xiao Ma, on that theme of like, so we've been talking a lot about what the risk in Laos and stuff. What about in China with these cities that are fighting to get these railway stations? do they have any financial risks? Is there something that they're in, maybe potentially endangered from actually having a railroad built into their city?
Thanks for the question. I think that's a very good one. I think this points to an overall issue that China is facing, Chinese economy is facing, is the rising debt concerning all these infrastructure programs. I think now the overall debt to GDP ratio amounts to 250% of GDP. So a lot of the Chinese localities, they are taking loans, just like the recipient countries in the Belt and Road, to build this railway. And these are all often very long-term loans, like 20 to 30 years long-term loans. And you see a moral hazard problem there. A lot of the local leaders, they're only there for 2 or 3 years, and they'll only care what happens in their tenure, whether they can generate growth, and leaving all the debt to be paid by paid by their successors. So I think only very few places. So within the railway system, it's not locality, but regional railway administration. Only very few places can have profitable schemes surrounding these railways. For example, the railway that connects Beijing and Shanghai, the Beijing-Shanghai high-speed railway is very profitable. But beside a few these hotlines, I would say a lot of places are now in serious problems. I don't think their income can cover even the interests of their debt, not the principles. So I think this is the issue that China is now dealing with, not just on the railway, but also other type of infrastructure project.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking totally different example, but when I was living in China initially in 1987, one thing that, I learned, like cement plants, there was a time like, like the overcapacity, like too many cement plants, too many coal-fired power plants, and then there's this debt issue. So, I mean, so there is such a thing as too many trains.
So that's a very good question. So in 2010, if you read the news, there are news report. I remember economists once reported news that the train connects Xi'an and Taiyuan, Shijiazhuang and Taiyuan. They were running empty. They were simply carrying chairs. Not a single passenger sits on the high-speed railways. But now, if you look at these earliest, the trains that were built earliest, they are all overcapacitated by passengers. But so I think we need to look at the questions and different phases. Now the railway ministry says by 2035, every city with at least 500,000 population needs to have. I think that's overcapacity for sure. We don't know what will happen going forward. Now with government, it seems there are two contradicting directions. On the one hand, government continue to invest in infrastructure. On the other hand, the central government is also tightening grips on local government's ability to leverage loans from banks. They want to control the crisis. So the consequence of these contradictory trends is that only places with relatively good financial standing they can continuously invest in. But I hope this is the trend. We don't know. But for example, this year with slowdown in economy due to strict control of COVID, now the government is encouraging in infrastructure investment again to shore up economic growth. Maybe such restriction will be relaxed. So I don't know what will happen in the medium to long run, but I definitely think the debt issue will be a very critical issue surrounding China's infrastructure program in the future.
But it also points to the importance of the work that you're doing, because my research assistants say that you're all over social media in China about your book that you did. And so I think it's good that you are doing this kind of solid research to ask these kind of questions. Same thing for Selina and Kelly. You guys are this is really important research that you've been doing. And I know that, and just real quickly, what's your next step? Selina, are you hopping off the train to jump on some other infrastructure?
Well, I've always been working on water issues, so dams and all that is still part of it. So not working on Trans-Pacific for now, but maybe in the future, we will do an update on what's happening with the Pan-Asia Railway. But definitely infrastructure is part of, the overall work that I do when I cover China and Southeast Asia relations.
Great. And how about you, Kelly? You're going to be, as soon as you can, going back to Laos and diving deeper into the railroads, or some other topic?
So as I said earlier, I'm kind of everywhere in terms of Chinese investment in Laos. But I have one focus, which is looking at the social infrastructure that assembles different kind of Chinese projects. So I'm basically looking at the commercial intermediaries that are behind the scene, cooking up ideas and putting projects together. Yeah.
Well, great. I mean, I want to thank you. You all gave great talks, good conversation. And also going to say right here, invite you to write some blogs for us as you're moving forward with your new research, because it's fascinating stuff. And it's I mean, the US, we've got a big Build Back Better campaign, the Build Back World stuff. We're going to be doing more on infrastructure at the China Environment Forum on these topics, and you guys kicked us off on it. But so thank you very much. Also want to tell the audience, thanks for tuning in and asking your questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but have a good rest of your summer, everyone. And again, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.